In the spring of 1944, the war in the West had a strange character for Germany. There had not yet been a great battle in France, but the entire military system was oriented toward expecting a blow that everyone knew was inevitable. The supreme command on the Western Front, the Oberbefehlshaber West, was in the hands of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, an officer of the old Prussian school who saw the strategic problem clearly. Germany did not have sufficient means to prevent an Allied landing. At most, it could try to defeat it after it happened. Rundstedt proposed a defense in depth, allowing the enemy to get ashore and then hurling against him the armored divisions kept in reserve. Hitler, however, distrusted that approach. In December 1943, he sent Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to France with the mission of inspecting and strengthening the so-called Atlantic Wall. Rommel arrived with the experience of North Africa, where he had suffered Allied air supremacy, and his conclusion was radically different. Any mobile counterattack would be destroyed from the air before reaching the battlefield. The only chance of success was to stop the invasion on the very coastline. The battle will be decided on the beach, he kept repeating. That doctrinal divergence, mobile defense versus rigid defense, was never resolved and shaped all German preparations prior to D-Day. On paper, Atlantic Europe was to be protected by a gigantic chain of fortifications, the Atlantic Wall. But the reality was very different. Germany had to defend more than 5,000 kilometers of coastline with limited resources, while priority continued to be the Eastern Front. Of the 58 divisions available in the West in June 1944, 33 were static divisions, without their own transport, composed largely of older soldiers, convalescents, or foreign recruits. Many units could scarcely move beyond a few kilometers. Construction materials were scarce, cement was rationed, and the organization Todd could not complete the plans. In numerous sectors, the fortifications were simple earth trenches, vulnerable to rain and bombardment. Rommel tried to compensate for these weaknesses by saturating the beaches with obstacles. He ordered the installation of thousands of anti-landing structures, metal gates, steel hedgehogs, mined ramps, slanted stakes with explosives designed to pierce the hull of the landing craft. In some sectors, more than 3,700 obstacles were placed along barely a few kilometers of coast. Many were hidden under the water at high tide so that the Allies could not see them or avoid them. The idea was to turn the sea itself into a defensive weapon. The fundamental problem remained the uncertainty over the landing site. For Hitler and the High Command, the logical point was the Pas de Calais, the place closest to England, from where the Allies could cross the Channel in a few hours and advance directly toward Germany. That conviction was reinforced by the Allied deception operation that simulated the existence of a large army opposite Calais. Normandy seemed a secondary objective, too far away and with difficult tides. Rommel, without ruling out Calais, insisted that an attack could also occur in Normandy or even in Brittany, but he never managed to have all forces redistributed according to that criterion. In the sector that would later become famous as Omaha Beach, the defense had initially been in the hands of the 716th Infantry Division, a static division of about 7,000 men, well below its theoretical strength, equipped with hundreds of machine gun positions, mortars, and anti-tank weapons, but with little mobility and uneven quality. In March 1944, that sector was reinforced by the 352nd Infantry Division, a newer unit, formed, with veterans recovered from the Russian front and young recruits of 18 and 19 years of age. This division had greater firepower than an equivalent American division, with abundant automatic weapons, 105 and 150 mm artillery, and anti-tank units with self-propelled guns and Stug-3, although it suffered from a lack of fuel and large-scale training. Defensive positions were organized in the so-called Widerstandsnester, resistance nests, small complexes of bunkers, guns, and trenches designed to rake the beach with crossfire. Many guns were oriented laterally to fire along the coast rather than out to sea, a layout intended to destroy troops already landed. Behind them, several kilometers inland, the divisional artillery had its pieces pre-registered on specific points of the beach, ready to open immediate fire as soon as an invasion was detected. German air support was practically non-existent. The Luftwaffe had barely about 160 operational fighters in northern France, and constant Allied bombing forced them to withdraw inland just before the invasion. At sea, the Kriegsmarine likewise could not seriously oppose the Allied fleet. In practice, the defense would rest almost exclusively on infantry and coastal artillery. The most critical element was control of the armored reserves. The panzer divisions did not depend directly on the commanders in France, but on Hitler personally. Without his express authorization, they could not move. That meant any reaction to a landing would be subject to decisions made hundreds of kilometers from the front, with inevitable delay. In early June 1944, while soldiers dug trenches, laid mines, and reinforced positions, bad weather in the English Channel seemed to rule out an immediate operation. Storms and heavy seas reinforced the sense that no fleet would try to cross in those conditions. Many commanders believed the invasion would not occur until the weather improved. Even Rommel temporarily left the front, convinced there would be no important operations in those days. At 22:15 on 5 June, some stations intercepted a coded message addressed to the French resistance announcing operations in the next 48 hours. It was taken as another false alarm. No general alert was issued. Meanwhile, already at midnight, Allied minesweepers were opening corridors toward Normandy, and toward 3, the naval assault force was about 23 kilometers off the coast of Omaha. From 1 onward, reports began of scattered paratroopers in neighboring sectors. The LXXXIV Corps interpreted this as a limited airborne operation and ordered its mobile reserve, the Kampfgruppe Meyer, to move westward, away from Omaha. That decision, based on incomplete information, left the zone that would be attacked hours later without immediate reinforcements. From 3:20, the artillery of the 352 Infantry Division began to suffer air bombardments, especially at Pointe du Hoc. However, darkness and bad weather still concealed the scale of the attack. Only at 5:02 did coastal observers report having seen numerous naval silhouettes. By 5:20, it was already clear it was a gigantic fleet. Naval bombardment began at 5:45 and lasted about 40 minutes. Though intense, it was less effective than expected. Many Bauform 667 casemates, trenches, and machine gun nests remained intact. The strategic air bombardment also did not hit fully. Of the hundreds of bombers that attacked, many bombs fell inland due to delays in release. Thus, when the preparatory fire ceased, much of the German defensive system was still operational. At 6:30, the first landing craft arrived off Omaha. The defenses were manned by elements of the 716 Infantry Division, a static division of about 7,000 men, reinforced since March by the 352nd Division, a more combative unit with 3 regiments and artillery support, with 105 and 150 mm howitzers, emplaced about 10 kilometers behind the coast. The positions were organized into 14 fortified points, covering the 5 natural exits from the beach. When the ramps of the craft dropped, MG-42 machine guns, mortars, and PAK-38 and PAK-40 anti-tank guns opened fire at ranges under 600 meters. Many boats grounded on sandbars 5,100 meters from shore, forcing American soldiers to advance on foot under direct fire. In the first assault, of about 1,450 men, more than a third became casualties in the first hour. In the Dog Green sector, entire companies were virtually destroyed. From the German bunkers, the initial impression was that the attack was being contained. Telephone communications, however, began to be cut by the bombardments, and reports arrived in fragments. At 7:35, the divisional commander, General Dietrich Kress, requested a counterattack with the reserve. Authorization came, but the troops were too far away, previously diverted toward the other range. Paratroopers and also subjected to Allied air attacks during their march. While the German command tried to recompose the situation with orders that took hours to carry out, small groups of American infantry began to infiltrate between the strongpoints. By midday on 6 June, the Germans understood that this was the beginning of the large-scale invasion they had expected elsewhere and at another time. When the first American assault companies were advancing toward Omaha Beach, the German defenders had already been at their combat posts for more than an hour. From those elevated positions, between 30 and 50 meters above sea level, observers could clearly see the landing craft approaching from almost 4,000 meters away. Fire control officers did not wait for the boats to reach the beach. They used ballistic tables prepared during weeks of training and began adjusting ranges while the first waves were still far out, correcting with binoculars the point of impact of mortars and light guns. The artillery pieces positioned farther back, many of them more than 5 kilometers away, received pre-established coordinates through a gridded reference network that had been calculated before the invasion. The fire was not improvised, it was the result of exercises repeated since spring. When the craft began to drift due to the swell, the defenders noticed that the landings did not coincide with the planned sectors. This produced a brief uncertainty in German command posts, but it also generated an unexpected tactical advantage. As many boats concentrated in unplanned areas, MG-42 machine guns could cover more densely occupied zones. Their rate of fire, close to 1,200 rounds per minute, made it possible to create true curtains of continuous fire. At several points, Park anti-tank guns, hidden in lateral casemates oriented at an angle to the beach, fired along the coastal line instead of out to sea, hitting landing craft from the side and multiplying the destructive effect. The Allied naval bombardment, which had lasted less than 3/4 of an hour in that sector, had raised large columns of sand and smoke, but many concrete positions remained operational. The Regelbau-type casemates were covered by several meters of compacted earth and designed to withstand indirect naval impacts. During the artillery preparation, the crew remained almost isolated inside. The gun chief followed the situation by field telephone, the observer controlled the outside through periscopes, while gunner and loader waited beside the gun already aligned in its sector. Assistants prepared ammunition and kept access points clear, and another man monitored ventilation, power, and sealed closures to prevent smoke and overpressure from disabling the position. When the bombardment ceased, the routine activated with mechanical precision. The embrasure protections were removed, the mechanisms were checked, and within minutes the piece was back in battery, ready to open fire as if nothing had happened outside. As the ramps of the LCVPs dropped and American soldiers threw themselves into the water, German commands transmitted fragmented reports by telephone. Orders insisted on maintaining controlled fire to conserve ammunition, especially for the 81mm mortars, whose supply was limited. However, the intensity of the fighting forced many detachments to fire more than planned. Some positions consumed in the first 2 hours up to 60% of their reserves of small arms ammunition. At the same time that the beaches were bathed in blood, in the interior of the Carentan, one of the few mobile reserves available went into action. The German paratroopers of Fallschirmjäger-Regiment 6, commanded by Oberst Friedrich von der Heide. This unit, formed for offensive airborne operations, had been sent to Normandy in May 1944 as a rapid intervention force in the face of an invasion expected to be imminent. Its battalions arrived by rail from southern France and Belgium and deployed without the heavy support of a field division. Its function was to go wherever the breach occurred. When the American drops began in the early hours of 6 June, the regiment received orders to march immediately toward the Carentan-Sainte-Mère-Église sector. The first units advanced in fragmented columns, subjected to constant air attacks, losing vehicles even before entering combat. Many men covered the last kilometers on foot, with limited ammunition and no clear contact with other formations. When they arrived, they found the front completely dislocated. Groups of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division held crossroads, dikes, and farms, while others still wandered, trying to regroup after the scattered drops. The reason for concentrating the regiment there was clear. Carentan constituted the junction point between Utah and Omaha. If the Americans took the town, they would link both beachheads, create a continuous front, and open the door to expansion into the interior of Normandy. If they were stopped, the landed forces would remain separated by the marshes of the Douve, vulnerable to local counterattacks. The town also dominated the raised roads that crossed the flooded terrain, true mandatory corridors through which any movement had to be channeled. Von der Heide deployed his battalions in depth, using the terrain as a defensive multiplier. I Bataillon positioned itself on the northern approaches, covering the long causeway that led directly into the town. 2. Bataillon occupied positions at Saint-Côme-du-Mont and the surrounding hedgerows, while elements of 3. Bataillon acted as a mobile reserve for immediate counterattacks. The companies established resistance nests in stone farmhouses, dug positions among the bocage embankments, and emplaced MG-42s to sweep the roads with crossfire. Mortars became the main support, since observation for artillery was nearly impossible. The first combats were sudden and extremely close encounters. German patrols moved between the hedgerows and collided at a few meters with American detachments trying to secure the roads. The bocage prevented any overall view. Each field was a small independent front. Orders were transmitted by foot messengers, and many decisions fell to section leaders who fought practically isolated. Between 8 and 11 June, the fighting concentrated on the approaches to Carentan. The Americans tried to advance along the raised causeway that crossed the marshes, a straight and exposed tongue of land, while the Fallschirmjäger defended it with grazing fire from hidden positions. The Allied advance was carried out literally step by step, crawling under machine gun fire that dominated the entire length of the dike. Each hedgerow taken had to be cleared with grenades before they could continue. Inside the town, the German paratroopers organized a defensive system in islands, connected by covered routes. Houses turned into strongpoints, attics used as sniper posts, and courtyards linked by trenches made it possible to move without exposure. The urban fighting was brief but intense. The culminating moment came on 13 June when von der Heide decided to employ the forces he still had in a counterattack southwest of Carentan, in the area of meadows and sunken lanes that would later be known as Bloody Gulch. After a week of continuous fighting, the 6th Parachute Regiment had been reduced to a little more than 2,000 men, organized into very depleted companies, some of barely 60 to 80 effective. During the night, these remnants of the regiment were hastily assembled, reinforced with an improvised group of about 10 to 15 Stug and tanks from armored training units, together with heavy mortars and a few pieces of light artillery. The plan was to advance at dawn from the bocage, cover an attack front of approximately 2 kilometers, and strike elements of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division, which was still deploying. At daybreak, around 6, the companies emerged from the hedgerows in a staggered formation. The armored vehicles opened fire from the raised lanes, while the paratroopers advanced in 20 to 40-meter bounds, using drainage ditches and embankments as cover. The clash occurred at distances under 100 meters, with fighting around farms and isolated crossroads that changed hands several times in a few hours. During the morning, the German thrust achieved local penetrations of up to 1 kilometer, disorganizing the forward American lines. However, the attack lacked depth. From 9:10 onward, U.S. artillery began to concentrate fires over the open fields, and armored reinforcements came into action. Under that bombardment, with no air support and insufficient ammunition, the counterattack lost cohesion and the units fell back once again into the bocage. From then on, the fighting turned into a war of attrition. The regiment, which in a few days had suffered hundreds of casualties that were difficult to replace, held successive positions south of Carentan through ambushes, local counterattacks, and echeloned withdrawals. The front barely shifted a few hundred meters per day, on terrain where every hedgerow became a defensive line and every field gain demanded new losses. Far away, on the other side of the beaches, the struggle for the most important city if Paris was to be reached in the following months was beginning to unfold. From the British beaches of Sword and, farther west, Juno, the initial advance managed to penetrate 6 to 8 kilometers inland during D-Day, but that progress slowed as it approached the defensive belt organized north of Caen. There, elevated roads, railway lines, and small villages built of solid stone converged, offering natural resistance positions. The German defense used those localities as interconnected fire centers, supported by 105 and 150 mm field batteries emplaced south of the Orne, out of the immediate range of Allied naval artillery. The staggered arrival of armored divisions transformed the fighting into a struggle of constant reaction. Between 7 and 15 June, several battle groups with Panther tanks, Panzer IVs, and Stug self-propelled guns were introduced into the eastern sector, operating in small local counterattacks of 10 to 20 vehicles, launched at dawn or dusk to avoid Allied aviation. The area between Caen, Saint-Lô, Bayeux, and Falaise was subjected to an almost continuous bombardment carried out by the British 2nd Tactical Air Force. For this, they were supported by B-26 Marauder and A-20 Boston medium bombers, as well as Typhoon, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-38 Lightning fighter bombers. On days of good weather, more than 2,500 tactical sorties per day could be flown over a front barely more than 80 kilometers wide. The main objective was to destroy positions and paralyze German mobility. The railway junctions of Lisieux, Argentan, Vire, Thury-Harcourt,
and Condé-sur-Noireau were attacked repeatedly from May 1944 onward. By June, more than 70% of the usable rail network in Lower Normandy was disabled or functioning intermittently, forcing the movement of troops by road, precisely where Allied air power was most effective. Motorized columns attempting to move toward the front had to do so at night. During the day, any isolated vehicle was attacked in missions known as cab rank, in which squadrons of fighter bombers orbited continuously awaiting attack orders from forward observers. In sectors such as Tilly-sur-Seulles or the Caen-Villers-Bocage road, daytime movements virtually disappeared after 10 June. British Typhoon fighter bombers, armed with 60-pound RP-3 rockets, specialized in attacking armored concentrations and moving columns. Their individual accuracy was not always high, but repeated low-level passes forced tanks to disperse, hide under trees, or halt any attempt at concentration, drastically reducing their offensive capability. Armored units trying to regroup in areas such as Evrecy, Noyers-Bocage, or Mortain suffered constant losses even before entering combat. On some movements toward the Caen area, it took as much as 10 to 12 hours to cover barely 30 kilometers due to continuous detours, stops, and concealments forced by the air threat. One of those aviators observed something revealing from the air. The German positions marked on the maps appeared empty. The columns moved without pause, changing location again and again, avoiding settling on the terrain. It was not an orderly withdrawal in depth, but a constant movement to escape detection and immediate attack. In that scenario of permanent pressure, something even more unsettling than the bombings themselves began to be perceived. The front was not being pushed uniformly, it was being compressed from the flanks. With British and Canadians pressing from the north and Americans, along with French forces, advancing from the south, the German deployment risked being enveloped. On 10 August, General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge requested authorization to withdraw. 5 days later, on 15 August, Hitler responded by dismissing him and handing command to General Feldmarschall Walther Model, a specialist in stabilizing critical situations. The High Command then decided to organize an immediate strike, local and almost improvised, before Allied pressure definitively opened the road south. There was no time to concentrate a full division or plan a classic operation. It was a matter of throwing what was available, quickly, to disrupt the enemy advance and gain hours, perhaps days of operational breathing room. In that context, a limited armored counterattack was prepared, bringing together about 500 Panzer Grenadiers, many belonging to the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, supported by around 20 Panzer IVs of SS Panzer Regiment 12. In the vanguard, as the spearhead, barely 4 or 5 Tiger I of the 2nd Company of Schwer SS Panzer Abteilung 101 were concentrated. 5 7-ton machines whose 88mm gun remained feared, even when outnumbered. The Tigers remained hidden in the Les Jardins area, a few hundred meters from Allied observation points, concealed behind embankments and vegetation screens. There, Normandy favored whoever knew how to use it. The drivers had nestled the tanks behind the hedgerows, covering them with nets and branches. Only small openings for ventilation and observation remained visible. The engines stayed off so as not to betray their position. At 12:05, the urgent order arrived to move towards Sintho. Michael Wittmann's command tank, identified with the number 007, set off along rural lanes, turning between embankments, skirting orchards, and destroyed houses. The movement was carried out in tactical silence, without firing, trying to preserve the element of surprise in a landscape where every bend could reveal the column. The Tigers came out of their hiding place as if the hedgerow spat them out. They lined up in column, one behind another, advancing north-northwest parallel to the Falaise road, but slightly offset, about 150 meters to the east. That detail, minimal on a map, was enormous in a hedgerow country. That displacement protected against expected frontal fire from the north, but left the flank exposed to crossfire from the northeast. From orchards and tree-lined edges, they advanced across open ground, with short stops in hollows to fire at long range. At around 1,800 meters, they could damage Shermans with some ease if the target presented itself. But the real duel was not going to be decided at 1,800. It was going to be decided at the distance at which a British 17-pounder could punch through a side.
The first serious contact came from where nothing could be seen. At Del de la Roque, behind a tree-lined hedgerow marking the edge of an orchard, a firefly was hidden, the Sherman into which they had put a long 1/7-inch gun, designed precisely for this. The Tigers advanced in single file, side exposed, unaware they were being ranged. They were allowed to come closer, from 1,200 meters to 800. At 12:39, when the range was already execution distance and the Tigers were nearing an isolated red-roofed building beside the road, the Firefly showed the minimum, just enough, and fired. 2 quick hits set a Tiger on fire. The column had no time to understand what was happening. It saw smoke and flame in its own line. Whitman's second Tiger tried to swing its turret, the huge 88mm searching for the enemy among leaves and trunks. The Firefly, following its doctrine, immediately backed off to return under the orchard's cover, and the Tiger fired blindly into the hedgerow. At that distance, the 88mm was lethal if it found flesh or plate, but the problem was the same as in all Normandy. The real target almost never showed itself fully, and what did show itself was a trap. In a few minutes, the scene became intense and strangely short, as if the battle were decided in bursts. The Firefly brought the gun out again, chose the next target, and struck it. At 12:47, another Tiger exploded in a ball of fire. It was in that window, at that range, that Command Tiger 007 took the hit that destroyed it brutally. The internal explosion was so violent that the turret was blown off and the hull was left turned into an open furnace. That kind of death left no room for stories or rescues. The remaining tanks tried to react, but reacting meant moving, and moving meant exposing the side once again. With the front saturated with fire, every meter was an irreversible decision. What followed was the spillover of combat into the broken terrain. Farther east and south, the rest of the German armor tried to continue the blow with Panzer IVs and some Panthers, using the hedgerow network as corridors, seeking cover, infiltrating more than advancing. The landscape, however, was a mousetrap, a hollow like Le Petit Ravin, with steep slopes and fruit trees, forced the tanks to enter one by one, with no room to deploy, no possibility of turning freely. In that labyrinth, a Panzer IV could surprise, fire, and disappear. But it could also be trapped, take crossfire, and burn with no way out. The 75mm Shermans saturated the area with impacts that, even if they did not penetrate a Tiger's front, forced it to maneuver, and the 17 Plygads, patient, waited for the angle. There were duels at 1,200 and 1,500 meters, and also clashes at distances where the muzzle flash was almost a slap. By that point, the feeling was of a fight coming apart. It was no longer a counterattack with shape. It was a sum of tanks trying to survive, shots arriving from invisible lines, engines revving to reverse down a narrow lane, crews trying to orient themselves amid smoke and leaves. When the Falaise pocket began to close between 16 and 21 August, the German armies in Normandy, mainly the 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, were compressed into a corridor only a few kilometers wide between Trun, Chambois, and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives. Through that space, tens of thousands of men tried to escape under constant artillery, fire, and air attacks. Material losses were devastating. Between 1,500 and 2,000 armored vehicles and half-tracks were abandoned or destroyed. Thousands of trucks and virtually all the heavy artillery that could not be towed away in time. Roads were blocked by entire columns hit by bombs and rockets. Many guns were disabled by their own crews when they ran out of ammunition or tractors. In several sectors, the remnants of complete divisions had to leave on foot, leaving behind radios, maps, fuel depots, and mobile workshops. The logistical capacity of the Western Front was ruined in a matter of days. In human terms, around 50,000 soldiers died inside the pocket, and some 40,000 to 50,000 were taken prisoner. Of the approximately 200,000 men making up the trapped forces, only a portion managed to escape eastward, many without heavy weapons or organization. Divisions that in June had gone into Normandy with 12,000 to 15,000 men were reduced to a few thousand. Some, like several Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, ceased to exist as operational units and had to be rebuilt months later in Germany with inexperienced recruits. The impact on command was just as severe. The chain of command fragmented during the retreat, command posts destroyed, links cut, and contradictory orders issued from different levels. Constant pressure and loss of control caused dismissals and hasty replacements. Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had assumed command of the Western Front after Erwin Rommel's wounding, was discredited by the disaster. Shortly afterward, he was relieved and committed suicide during the transfer to Germany. Command passed to Walter Model, a specialist in emergency defenses, whose task was no longer to win the battle, but to try to rebuild a coherent front with what remained. After Falaise, German forces could no longer establish a continuous defensive line in France. The withdrawal toward the Seine became a series of improvised movements to avoid new encirclements. In barely 2 weeks, most of the French territory occupied for 4 years was lost. Paris was abandoned with no real possibility of defense, and the remnants of the units crossed into Belgium with enormous shortages of fuel, ammunition, and transport. The strategic consequence was irreversible. Normandy had consumed the German armored reserve in the west, destroyed much of its experienced officer corps, and eliminated the capacity for maneuver needed to contain mechanized offensives. From that moment on, the Western Front was condemned to a reactive defense, depending on hastily rebuilt units and on limited counterattacks, like the one that would be attempted months later in the Ardennes. The 1944 campaign in France thus ended not only with a territorial defeat, but with the definitive loss of German military initiative in the West.